Hi, today we're going to talk about the elements of visual communication, the components of an image, and some specific ones that we can pay attention to when we want to talk about how an image is making an argument and the things that are going on in an image. I'm going to talk about specifically 4 relationship pairs of elements, and I'm going to be using some National Geographic photos to help us think through these. The first pair is figure and ground. Figure is the thing that's in the foreground and ground is the background. So here the figures are the camels and the ground is the fire and the smoke. And with figure and ground, you want to ask yourself questions like, what is the relationship between the foreground and background elements? Which is more prominent? Which is more important? And what relationship is being created between them? So the image here is very striking because the relationship is not only very, very different in size. So the camels are very small compared to the fire and the smoke, but it's very different in intensity. The camels seem like they are not bothered at all by this giant fireball and huge amount of smoke that is seemingly right next to them. And that makes this even more terrifying, that this thing is so commonplace an occurrence that they're not even scared of it anymore. And so that makes this an even more terrifying image. So the relationship between figure and ground here is much more, is a very important part of this image, perhaps the most important part. Here we have a different relationship between figure and ground. The figure here is the cheetah. The ground is literally the actual ground, the sand and the earth. And here we have the cheetah covering, like literally going from the sky to off the photo. The cheetah is covering all of it, and it seems to be surveying its dominion, right? It's like the land is owned by the cheetah. The cheetah is crossing all of it with its body, and it seems like it's dominating the whole thing. So there's a relationship being suggested between the foreground figure and the background, between the figure and the ground itself. Okay, the second relationship that we can look at here, or the second pairing that I want to talk about, are shapes and space. So we want to look at things like, what are the major shapes and what do they mean? And here I want you to think all the way back to January when we talked about Little Red Riding Hood and how triangle shapes, when the base is pointed down, seem more stable, and rectangle shapes, when the bottom is down, seem more stable, the wide part, I'm sorry. But how diagonal shapes seem more threatening and how pointy shapes seem more threatening, right? Sharp shapes are threatening and round shapes are not. And as we look at this image, is the shark here a threatening shape or a calming shape? Because it's actually pretty round, right? We have a nice kind of like rounded shape here, and that's nice. We've got this nice roundness going on, right? On the other hand, it's going to erase it for me, yes. On the other hand, we have this very pointy shape happening here that makes a triangle, It is a very, very pointy triangle, and that makes me very nervous for the diver, right? And so maybe overall this is not a very calming image, even though there is that cuddly bit in the middle of the shark. It's very, very pointy on the outsides. And so we can think about that. We can also look at the space and the way that things are taking up space when things, we talked about this also when we were talking about Red Riding Hood. In fact, almost all of our discussion of Red Riding Hood was about shapes and space with a little bit of color. These things, there's nothing centered here. Everything is off center, everything is off kilter. There's nothing in this big space down here, and there's nothing to offset it up here, right? And so it feels kind of off kilter, and that off kilterness makes it so that the shark seems to be looming, that it feels a little bit more threatening because everything is out of balance and everything's a little bit out of whack, right? So you want to think about what shapes are here, what do those shapes mean, how do they make us feel, but you also want to think about how is the space being taken up, and is the space being taken up in a way that feels balanced and calm and pleasant, or is space being taken up in a way that feels unbalanced and concerning and threatening? Here's another example of shapes and space. So how do the shapes here make you feel? How does this space make you feel? And if it's hard to answer those questions right away, you can try using other senses or imagine yourself trying to do different kinds of things in this space. Is this a quiet space or a noisy space? Could you eat here? Could you have a birthday party here? Could you have a wedding here? Like what kind of a space is this, do you think? There are a lot of people here, and yet none of these chairs are out of place, and there's no stuff on the floor. There are hardly any people at all walking around. Like I see one. There's one person right here walking. And one here. And otherwise, like, there's not people walking along here, right? It's just these straight lines and sharp corners, straight lines, right? And everybody's sitting in straight rows. This seems to me like a place where it's quiet, where it's sterile, where you're not allowed to make any noises or crumbs or have joy. Seems very regimented. It is in fact a library. It is not like our library though, right? It's quite different from our library that we have, our new library. Imagine though if we had designed our new library to look like this. Imagine if this was the study space in our new library. How would you feel trying to study there? It feels here like the library is a maze, and also like it's trying to trap me in its orderliness. I don't know if I would learn a lot in this library. All right, the next pair I want to talk about is balance and direction. So some of the questions you can ask here are, where are the lines and or shapes pointing? Where does the eye motion go? And what takes up most of the space? So let's look at the owl here. Again, let's look at the lines. So we have these handy lines on the owl's wings that are just going like this, right? We can see the lines moving on the owl's wings. Ooh, that was not straight. And they all lead to this part of the owl, which has a line down the middle of it, like this, right? And where does that exclamation mark end? On this small, round mouse. So all these directional lines end up at the same place. And it doesn't matter where we start in the picture. If we start in this white space, we immediately want to look at something. And so we either look up and end up on the owl, which directs us down onto the mouse, or we look at the mouse, in which case we get trapped in a circle looking at the mouse. And so no matter where we start, we end up at the mouse. Erase these lines here so you can look at this picture yourself. Come back. Okay. And the shape of the owl is a large triangle, right? The shape of the mouse is a small circle. And we have, again, circle is small and cuddly, or not small, but cuddly. Triangle is sharp. And we have, again, the distinction there. And if we look at the space, the owl is taking up a lot of the space in the picture. I mean, there's a lot more owl space happening. There's almost no mouse space. There's a lot of owl space and there's a lot of white space. So there's empty space, right? Empty space. Owl space, mouse space, and kind of just like danger space. So it's divided kind of into thirds, right? The owl is a third, and then there's 2/3 of white space, and then there's this like tiny little bit of danger space and mouse space that the mouse kind of lives in. And that's what creates the dynamics of the pictures, that this mouse doesn't even know. It doesn't even know that it's living in danger space and that it's about to die and there's nothing it can do about it, and it's so overwhelming a fact and it has no idea, right? And the owl seems big not only because it's taking up a third of the picture, but also because it's taking up a third of the picture and it goes off the edge of the page. And when something goes off the edge of the page, it seems to us it could go on forever. Who knows how big this owl's wings are? It could just be going and going and going. We don't know. I mean, who knows? How big are owl's wings? I mean, they could be so big. I don't know. Do you know? In our imaginations, we don't know, and so we just kind of extrapolate that is like basically forever, infinitely large. Anything that touches the edge of a page, our brain's like, yeah, probably infinitely large. And so things that go to the edge of something we think of as going on for a very long time. So something that goes off the edge seems way bigger than something that doesn't, even if they are similar in size in actuality, and even if we know that in our brains, we still will think that a thing that touches the edge is much bigger than a thing that doesn't. Here's a different kind of balance and direction. So we don't have such overt lines here, but we still have lines and shapes pointing, we still have eye motion, and we still have space being taken up. So where is your eye naturally drawn? Where do you end up looking? Every time I look at this picture, I end up looking at this woman's eyes, always, over and over and over. Part of that is, again, the lines. So if I start here on the image, these lines here draw me up and into her face, and then I end up at her eyes. If I start here in the image, these lines bring me up and into her face, and I end up at her eyes. If I start up here in the image, her hair brings me down and onto her face, and I end up in the eyes, or here, right? If I start anywhere on this green, I just look and look and look until I get to the next green, which is her eyes, right? If I start over here, I might wander a little bit, and then I find these lines, and I end up in the hair, and I end up in her eyes, right? So everything ends up being a channel to get back to her eyes. If I start on her lips or her mouth, then there's this line here on her face, and I end up in the shadows of her nose, and I end up back in her eyes. All of the lines that are in this image end up leading back to her eyes. Now I have a lot of lines to erase. Okay. So all the lines here work that eye motion. There's also a fair bit to do with color, because this background is green, this little bit of her shirt is green, and then her eyes are green. And that's contrasted with the warmth of her skin tone and the warmth of her clothing, that really makes us drawn to her eyes from the background. And because of the balance here, there's nothing here, and so we want to go look for something, and that pushes us towards this edge of the image, and then she is looking directly at us, and so that catches our attention. We're kind of primed to, if someone's looking at us, to look back, and to see why they're looking at us and why they're paying attention to us. So we have that kind of instinctive response to do that. But because there's this large area of green space on the side of the image, we also have a sense that she's really important. And having that extra green space, that extra part of the image, makes it feel much more weighty that she's on the side. If we look at this cropped differently, you still end up at her eyes, but it doesn't seem so important and weighty. And yes, this image isn't color balanced in the same way as the other one. It's an image from the same series by the same photographer of the same woman, but it is not color balanced in the same way. But a lot of the difference comes from the lack of that large green area on the one side. Her gaze is still very intense, but you don't have that balance of the other side to be pushing you over and to act as a kind of counterbalance or counterweight to say, yes, this is very important, and to also kind of give you a point of respite from that gaze that's really, really intense. To give you a moment to rest somewhere. All right, last pair is color and lighting. So you want to think about the overall major colors. Are they cool or warm colors? We have here the background is cool colors and the foreground is warm colors. And so we get a really, really strong contrast between the background and the foreground. Are they bright or dark, pale or rich? So we have bright colors in the foreground and paler colors in the background. Is the overall lighting mostly bright or dark, warm or cool? So we have fairly dark lighting, somewhat dark lighting here. It's misty, it's overcast, it's not that bright, but the lighting tone is warm overall. Well, I guess it's the color balance is somewhat cool, but the tone of the light is fairly warm itself. And so you want to look at that, and you want to look at where there are points of particular contrast. So to me, this orange of what I assume is like a life preserver stands out a lot because it's by far the brightest thing. And it's such a contrast to the kind of really hazy blue that's all around it. And that bright blue color and the bright orange really makes me think that this is very warm water and that everything is steam that's here. Whereas otherwise I might have thought that this was a cold picture and that this was ice and mist. But I don't know, maybe it's hot. Maybe this is steam. I'm not really sure. But you want to look for these points of contrast and where things are standing out as really different. All right, so here we have exactly the same set of questions. We're looking again at the lighting. The overall lighting here is dark and very, very warm. The lighting, in fact, is quite yellow and yellow-brown in tone. We have a lot of oranges and yellows and browns in color. I would guess that this location, based on just the coloring that I'm seeing, is very hot, very humid probably, and very gritty. I would guess that there's a lot of sand in my teeth. That's just what the picture makes me feel like looking at it. And I can see that there's, like a purple splotch on the left there. I don't know if it's a carpet or something, but pretty much everything else, other than the man's orangish, it's kind of a carmine red vest, and then there's kind of that same color in the tent on the left, the upper left corner. Everything else is kind of yellow or brown. And so we can look at this and see where those two pieces of color and that purple are doing some particular work in making him stand out as different, and then how everybody else and everything else is kind of blending in together and being the same, and how the whole background is giving it atmosphere, right? And what atmosphere that's creating and what kind of a sense or feel that is giving the scene or the setting. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of chances to try this out yourself. You should get some sort of friend to explain these to. I am not going to, I just explained all of these images and what I saw in them to you. I would like you to do this yourself and explain the pairs and the elements. You can explain them to a human who is quarantined with you, well, self-isolating with you. You can explain them to your imaginary friend. I have here, in case you don't have a friend with you, this is Vega. Vega is a snow leopard kitten, and she is very happy to listen to you talk about these things, so she's going to be here. But you should analyze each of these images using all four of the pairs that I just talked through, and practice using them before you have to do them on your image. So go ahead and pause the video now and write down your own answers to the four pairs. And then do the same thing here. Okay, so these are both images of, oh, thank you, Vega, you can go. These are both images of protests from Baltimore, Maryland from 2014. They were both from the same street, from the same day, and each photo tells a really different story about what happened. Each photo makes a different argument about what happened, right? So what argument does each photo make? How do their elements shape the argument that they're making? And if you only saw one of these photos, would you have a good understanding of what happened? I chose these two particular photos because these are two photos that I saw pretty often. Well, very often. I saw over and over and over and over and over on social media, shared by different ones of my friends, never together. They always were sharing the images of the people on the police car or the images of the people with the child as the representative image of the protest. And none of my friends were talking with each other about the same thing. They were each like, "You're crazy. That didn't happen. My version of it happened." And I was, sitting there just outside Baltimore going, yeah, both of these happened. These are the extremes of what happened on either end of it. And, let's talk about this. So, but images were very powerful in framing the coverage of that event. So, and many of you have chosen images from photojournalism, which became famous because they were used to represent an entire event or movement in a way that they were chosen to represent days or months or even years of people doing things, and a single image had to stand in for all of the complexity of that. So a lot of things go into a single image sometimes, even when it's taken kind of candidly in the moment, as both of these were. But they tell really different stories from each other, right? And both of them happened, and both of them are true, and both of them are part of what happened on the streets of Baltimore that day. Okay, we're not going to do more analyzing of images from Baltimore. You can if you want to. The PowerPoint slides are up on our course space. I'm just going to really quickly skip through all of these. But if you do feel like you want to practice doing this some more, they are available there. All of these are from the same protests, and you can see that they are all different takes on the same event and make really, really different visual arguments about what is happening. Okay, so here is the part where you get to do this, and this is the reason that we're focusing on this really heavily right now, is that you're working on a project where you're analyzing a culturally important image. So I would like you to go through this process with your culturally important image. First observe and then analyze your culturally important image. What are the elements? What are they doing? And how does each element contribute to the argument that is being made in your image? This is engagement assignment 6, image elements. It is a writing assignment. I mean, basically you're going to answer a series of questions for me. And next class period, which will happen after Easter, because this is our only class this week, You will be doing a series of Photoshop assignments that will take this writing and turn it into editing so that you can pair the writing and the written observations and analysis with Photoshop editing to demonstrate these things visually. So you'll get to do both sides of it, but I want you to have a sense of what you are doing and why you want to manipulate your image in Photoshop before you do so. So go ahead and do, excuse me, go ahead and do engagement assignment 6, and I will see you after Easter. I hope you have a good break, and remember, don't touch anybody else's face.